Hi, my name is Larry Jordan, and this is an excerpt of a recent Power Up webinar taking a look at video compression techniques inside Apple Compressor. A couple definitions before we start: codec and bitrate. Codec, which is a contraction of compressor and decompressor, is the mathematics that's used to convert light and sound into numbers that can be stored and played back from a computer. Codecs are the heart and soul of compression. There is no single codec that is perfect for capture, editing, and distribution, which is why we have so many hundreds to choose from. Bitrate is the speed in bits per second, abbreviated BPS, and notice the lowercase b, it's important, of a media file during playback. We also call this data rate or bandwidth. Controlling bitrate is a key element of compression. This also determines how smoothly a web video will stream. So here's the first rule of compression. When you compress, which is also called encode, when you compress a file to make it smaller, you are always, absolutely, and irretrievably throwing away data which cannot be recovered later. Therefore, you want to compress your file as few times as possible to preserve as much data as possible. And never recompress a compressed file, because recompressing a compressed file only looks worse. Transcoding a file, which means converting it to a higher quality format, such as converting from AVC HD to ProRes or H.264 to ProRes, does not involve data loss, at least not to the same degree. Here's an analogy. Compression is like pouring a full bathtub of water into a bucket. The essence of the water is the same, but you're throwing out a lot of water that was contained in a bathtub to get what remains to fit inside the bucket. Our goal then is to select what gets thrown out so that the remaining essence is as true to the original as possible. Here's the second compression rule. The higher the quality of the source file, the higher the potential quality of the compressed files derived from it. Now, you can't make a compressed file look better than the source file, with the possible exception of making the frame size smaller. And the reason that I say potential quality is that if you have a really perfect source file, but you set the settings wrong, bad settings can make even a pristine master look bad. It's typified by the adage, if you start with garbage and put it in, you're going to get garbage back out. And here's the third compression rule. When compressing a file, you apply settings to determine what you want the source file to become. I get dozens of emails a week from people who say, Larry, I want to compress this 83 gigabyte file to fit onto a DVD, but the DVD only holds about 4 gigabytes. How do I get 83 gigabytes to fit onto 4 gigabytes? And the answer is, you don't care. You don't care how big the source file is. It's absolutely irrelevant. What your compression settings are determining is not what the source file is. It's determining what you want the compressed file to become. So by applying DVD compression settings, regardless of how big the source file is, the compressed file will be small enough to fit onto a DVD, all other settings being equal. Never worry about the size of the source file. I mean, make it look as good as you can. You worry about the quality, but not the size. Don't even worry about the codec. Worry about what you want that source file to become. So then, what determines file size? Our goal when creating videos for the web is to get the highest possible image quality from the smallest possible bitrate. Now remember, bitrate is the bandwidth, the data transfer speed across the internet. And many of us pay for the bandwidth that our files consume. For instance, every month I get 2 bills. One bill is for the bandwidth consumed by our membership in the video training library, and the other is bandwidth for products that are purchased from our store. I want to have both of these be as high a quality as possible, but I don't want to waste money, so I compress my files to get the best possible quality at the smallest possible file size. File size is the size measured in megabytes of a media file, and file size is totally dependent upon bitrate. Low bit rates create smaller files. High bit rates create larger files, and smaller files download and play faster. But this is file size. It is not image quality. See, bit rate, the rate that we transfer data, Although bitrate determines the size of the file, files encoded at the same bitrate will generally have the same file size, but they may not have the same image quality unless they also have the same compression specifications. Let me give you an example. Here's a 480 by 270 picture on the left. Look at this really closely. Look at the smoothness in the skin tones. Notice the hair, and we can see each individual hair. This file on the left was compressed at 750 kilobits a second, kbps, kilobits per second. The same image on the right, compressed at the same bit rate, 750 kilobits a second. But look at the image size. It's 1920 by 1080. It's roughly 10 times bigger, but the bit rate hasn't changed. Look at the blockiness in the face. Look at how the smooth shading of the skin tone is lost. Look at how the hair is totally tearing out. The bit rate is the same, but we changed one key parameter, which is the image size, and what looks good at a small image looks terrible at a large image. The same movie, compressed at the same bit rate, but output to two different frame sizes. So although bitrate determines the size of the file, it doesn't determine image quality. Also, the frame size makes a difference. Bit rates that work for one format don't work for others. For instance, an NTSC DV frame contains about 345,000 pixels. 720p frame, almost triple that, 921,000 pixels. A 1080p frame, almost double that, 2.1 million pixels. 2K frame, 2.2. A 4K frame, 8.3 million pixels. When you've got that many more pixels, your data rate has to increase. The larger the frame size, the larger the data rate, and the larger the resulting file, which means that image quality is actually a balance of 5 factors: codec, compressed frame size, compressed frame rate, the amount of movement between the frames, and the bit rate of the compressed file. Different codecs require different settings for similar quality. For instance, ProRes requires a very high bit rate, but it's designed for editing efficiency. H.264 has a very low bit rate, but it doesn't have a lot of additional detail that makes color grading or editing particularly efficient. The compressed frame size, the larger the frame size, the faster we have to have a bit rate. We just saw as the number of pixels increases, the amount of data, the bandwidth, the data rate, has got to increase as well. Compressed frame rate. The faster frame rate, if you're going 24, it's going to be easier to compress than 25 or 30 or 60 frames a second. Now, given the way the compression algorithms work today, that's less important than it was, say, 10 years ago, but it's still relevant. The sleeper is the amount of movement between frames. Most compression for the web today compresses images in groups of files called a GOP, a group of pictures. So we group 7 frames together for PAL or 15 frames together for NTSC. And we look at the changes from frame 1 to frame 2, and we only record the changes. We look at the number of changes between frame 2 and frame 3, and we only record the changes. What we're recording is a difference file, that which changes from one frame to the next. What this means is if I've got me, for instance, here sitting on this camera, the camera's locked on a tripod, the background is not changing. So therefore, all the pixels in the background, all I have to do is just say repeat all those pixels. That which changes is just essentially my face, which is talking. So now I can compress that to a very small size because the background doesn't change. If, on the other hand, I was walking about the room, pacing back and forth, the pixels behind me would be changing as well as my movement. In other words, I would have to have a much faster bit rate to support that because every pixel in every frame changes from one frame to the next. So if your goal is to compress something to be really, really small, think of an animated GIF that goes onto a web page, you want to have as much not move as possible, which means that you can compress to a smaller file size. Maybe the background remains the same and you're only modifying the text. Movement between frames is a sleeper because that's the one thing that really drives up bit rates. Then we have the bit rate of the compressed file. Higher bit rates yield higher quality, but much larger file sizes. This is another really important picture, artifacts. Artifacts are strange rectangular blocks that appear in your video when the bit rate is too low. Look at the image on the left. Look at how crisp those lines are. Look at how smooth and fuzzy the eyebrow of this Chinese dragon is. Now look in the middle picture. Notice that we're starting to see a little bit of smearing in the edges. The edges are not quite as crisp. We're seeing a little bit of blockiness in the white around the eyebrow and the puff of white at the very top center of the frame. And then look at the low bandwidth, the low bitrate picture on the right. Look at how all of a sudden edges are totally destroyed. We're seeing rectangular blocks come in. We're seeing that the actual image is distorted. Why? Because the way that compression works is if the bitrate is not fast enough to compress individual pixels, it compresses groups of pixels in what's called a superblock. 4 pixels across by 4 pixels, or 16 by 16, or 64 by 64, and it assigns one color value and one grayscale value to that entire block of pixels. The good news is it's extremely efficient. The bad news is you lose all of your edge detail. So artifacts are caused by a compression bit rate that is too slow to properly display the compressed movie. I mentioned that we want to minimize movement. Video compression yields the smallest file sizes when there's very little movement between frames. The more movement between frames in the master file, from cameras, transitions, effects, or talent, the higher the bit rate that's needed to properly compress it. If small file sizes are key, you want to minimize on-screen movement, such as handheld cameras, film noise effects, video noise due to low light, or leaves waving in the background behind your actors. Here's the other thing you can do. The hardest thing to compress is something which is moving. So find in your movie that one shot where you want to make sure you maintain the absolute maximum image detail, say 3 to 5 seconds, where there's movement, and compress just those 3 to 5 seconds. If you can get the short movement to compress well, the rest of your movie is going to compress with no problem. But rather than waste hours and hours and hours compressing the entire movie and looking at it and realizing you've got artifacts, the hardest part to compress is that which is moving. Find a 3 to 5 second shot where it's moving and compress that, which takes just 5 or 10 seconds. If it looks good, then you're ready to compress the rest of the movie. This is a really important way to save hours of time wasted because you had the wrong compression settings, and then you had to compress the entire movie and look at it, and suddenly days go by, and you're still trying to figure out why it doesn't look good. Forget that. A small 5-second piece of movement where you want to retain the detail, compress that, and you're good to go. So that's the background behind how compression works. It's the background behind what we need to know to be able to make our compression look good. This has been an excerpt of a recent Power Up webinar taking a look at video compression techniques inside Apple Compressor. For the complete version of this online training, please visit our store at larryjordan.com/store and look for webinar 153A. By the way, membership is a great value. If you need to stretch your training dollars, a subscription membership to our video training library saves you money. You can access all of our videos for one low monthly price of only $19.99. That's more than 1,200 movies, hundreds of hours, all in depth and all up to date. Plus, members can attend any of our Power Up webinars for free. Our training covers Apple and Adobe software. We update it every week. And for more information, visit larryjordan.com/membership. And thanks.